They appeared from the sky like ghosts, men in foreign uniforms dropping silently into the heart of occupied France. Their parachutes blossomed against the moonlight, vanishing into the mist before German searchlights could find them. They carried no flags, no insignias that could save them if caught. Only radios, forged papers, and a single promise to ignite chaos behind enemy lines. These were the Jedburghs, an alliance of shadows born from desperation. A handful of Americans, Britons, and Free French commandos trained to wage a secret war in the dark. Their mission was to prepare France for its liberation, not from the front, but from within. By the time Allied forces stormed Normandy, these men were already there, living among villagers, hiding in barns, plotting ambushes, cutting railway lines, whispering rebellion into the occupied soil. The Germans called them saboteurs, the locals called them hope. And yet, their story has been almost erased, buried beneath the grander narratives of D-Day and victory parades. But the Jedburghs were something more than soldiers. They were proof that war was not only fought with tanks and planes, but with willpower, deception, and courage that refused to die even when surrounded by death. If you've ever wondered what it took to strike at the heart of the Nazi war machine from behind its own walls, stay with me, because this is not the story of generals or grand battles. It's the story of men who jumped into darkness and lit the fuse that changed the war itself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to keep these forgotten stories of World War II alive. Each one reminds us that history is not made by armies alone, but by the few who risk everything in silence. It began in London, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet room lit by cigarette smoke and the murmur of rain against blacked-out windows. The year was 1942, and the war had reached its darkest hour. France had fallen, the Wehrmacht stood at the Channel, and Britain, isolated, bombed, desperate, needed a weapon that wasn't made of steel or fire, but of cunning. In a small office behind locked doors, Winston Churchill signed a document that would change the shape of modern warfare. The words were simple: set Europe ablaze. From that order, the Special Operations Executive was born, an organization so secret that even its name was misleading. Its agents were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were saboteurs, linguists, thieves, assassins, civilians turned into ghosts. They were taught to kill silently, to vanish without trace, to make every act of destruction look like an accident. Behind the facade of respectable offices and quiet estates, Britain had begun building an army that would never march in daylight. Across the Atlantic, something similar was taking shape. In Washington, a man named William Wild Bill Donovan, a World War I hero with a lawyer's mind and a spy's instincts, convinced President Roosevelt that America needed its own organization of deception. Thus, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was born. The two groups, SOE and OSS, would soon merge their secrets, blending British experience with American audacity. Together, they would create the Jedburghs, a tri-national strike force composed of British, American and Free French officers who would fight behind enemy lines. Training began in the wild Scottish Highlands, where wind and fog swallowed everything but determination. The recruits were volunteers, drawn from every corner of the Allied world, commandos, linguists, mountaineers, even former criminals. They trained with live explosives, learned to use radios that could be hidden inside a loaf of bread, and memorized the art of sabotage. Each day, instructors drilled them in the grim mathematics of resistance. How long it took to cut a railway line, how much plastic explosive to blow a bridge, how to resist interrogation when the Gestapo came, because the Gestapo would come. The Jedburghs learned to fight dirty because war had become dirty. They practiced silent killing with knives, garrotes, and bare hands. They built bombs out of bicycle chains and sugar. They studied the psychology of fear, how to make an occupier doubt his own safety. "You are not heroes," their instructors told them. "You are instruments." That truth hung over every man who passed the final tests. They knew that once they were dropped into occupied France, there would be no backup, no extraction, no mercy. Their equipment was minimal: a Sten gun, a pistol, a radio, and cyanide. But their power came not from weapons, but from what they represented. For the first time, the Allies were entrusting ordinary men with extraordinary authority. To build armies from farmers, to disrupt an empire using rumor and dynamite. Each three-man team would carry the weight of a nation's hope on their backs. One American, one Briton, and one Frenchman, parachuting into darkness together. The code name Jedburgh had no meaning. It was chosen precisely because it sounded meaningless. A name no one could trace, a word that could vanish in static. Even their records were designed to disappear. In the official rosters of the Allied armies, these men barely existed. They were the war's rumor, a whisper moving behind the front lines. Yet among themselves, they were brothers. The Americans brought boldness, the British precision, and the French an unbreakable connection to the land they were fighting to free. Together, they became something neither government could control, a living organism of resistance. And as D-Day approached, they knew their time was coming. The beaches would never hold unless the interior of France was on fire first. Bridges had to fall. Trains had to derail. German communications had to collapse. The Jedburghs would be the match. As May turned to June 1944, London hummed with the invisible movement of these teams. Coded messages were transmitted to French partisans, the long sobs of violins of autumn. The poetic signal that invasion was near. In secret hangars, planes were loaded with parachutes and radios wrapped in oilcloth. Each man wrote a final letter home, knowing it might never be delivered, and strapped it to his chest beneath the harness. The night before departure, a few of them gathered in the mess hall of Milton Hall, their training base. They drank in silence, listening to the rain against the windows. Someone began to play a quiet tune on a harmonica, an old French song about home. No one spoke. They didn't need to. By dawn, they would be ghosts, scattered across occupied Europe, hunted from the moment they touched the ground. When their commanding officer entered, he said only this: "Gentlemen, tomorrow the world will know nothing of you, but it will feel what you do." And so, under a moon veiled by clouds, the first wave of Jedburgh teams boarded their aircraft. Each plane carried 3 men, one from America, one from Britain, one from France, and enough explosives to bring down a railway network. As the engines roared to life, one of the Americans, Lieutenant George Starr, looked out into the darkness and muttered, "Well, boys, here's to hell." Minutes later, they were airborne, heading into enemy skies. Below them, France slept under occupation, unaware that liberation was already falling from the clouds. The wind tore at the open door of the Halifax bomber as the red light above the hatch flicked to green. Below, the landscape of occupied France was swallowed in darkness, a land of silence, ration lines, and German patrols. Lieutenant George Starr clenched his parachute straps and took one last breath of cold air. The plane shuddered from anti-aircraft bursts far off to the west. He looked at his 2 partners, Major Colin Bancroft of the British Army and Captain André Dupont of the Free French. 3 men from 3 nations, tied together by mission, not by survival. "Bonne chance," André whispered. Then they jumped. The night swallowed them whole. The sound of the aircraft faded into the clouds, and for a brief, silent moment, there was nothing but the whisper of silk above their heads and the dull glow of moonlight over endless fields. Then impact. The ground rushed up like a hammer. George hit hard, rolled, and dragged his chute into the wheat. He lay still, heart pounding, listening. No engines, no dogs, no voices. Only the faint murmur of crickets and the smell of wet soil. He tapped the hidden signal light on his harness. 3 flashes. A moment later, 2 faint answers came from the distance. The team was alive, but they were not safe. By dawn, the Gestapo would know that something had fallen from the sky. German troops had learned to read the signs: flattened crops, torn parachute silk, the smell of foreign tobacco. If even one villager spoke too loudly, the nearest garrison would sweep the countryside within hours. Every minute mattered. The Jedburghs buried their chutes, hid their equipment, and moved toward the rendezvous point, a ruined farmhouse 2 kilometers east. The path wound through hedgerows heavy with dew. André led the way, his silhouette barely visible in the mist. Twice they froze as German trucks passed along the nearby road. The soldiers inside were laughing, their headlights sweeping the fields. One wrong step, one cough, and it would all be over. When they reached the farmhouse, the resistance was waiting. 2 men and a woman, farmers by appearance, fighters by necessity. They had been living under occupation for 4 years, pretending to obey while quietly sharpening their knives. Their leader, known only as Renard, greeted them with a nod. His face was thin, his eyes restless, but his handshake was steady. "You came through the storm," he said softly. "Then we start tonight." In a corner, a small table held the tools of rebellion, a radio transmitter, a tattered map, and a single bottle of wine saved for this moment. George unfolded his orders, printed in waterproof ink, encoded in French. Their first task was to sabotage a railway line near Limoges, one used to move German reinforcements toward Normandy. The timing was critical. The Allies were fighting to hold the beachheads, and every train delayed meant fewer German troops arriving at the front. But to reach that line, they would need to pass through 3 checkpoints and a town crawling with occupation police. The risks were absurd, yet that was the Jedburgh way. They existed to do what logic forbade. That night, under a moonless sky, the team moved with the resistance through the forest. The air smelled of pine and cordite from distant artillery. France was stirring. Rumors of the invasion had spread like wildfire. German patrols doubled their rounds. Vichy informants whispered to their masters. The whole country felt like a fuse waiting to burn. At the tracks near Limoges, the group worked quickly. André and Renard laid charges along the rails, their fingers shaking slightly as they pressed the detonators into place. George watched the horizon, every shadow a possible soldier. Somewhere an owl called. He checked his watch. 10 seconds. The explosion was small, almost delicate, a flash, a deep metallic groan, then the shriek of twisting steel. A locomotive carrying ammunition derailed moments later, crashing into the darkness with a roar that echoed for miles. The forest lit up with sparks and smoke. The Jedburghs melted back into the trees as German flares lit the sky. Searchlights swept across the wreckage, revealing chaos, soldiers shouting, officers barking orders, trains burning. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, the first spark of liberation in a country still bound in chains. By the next morning, the Germans were furious. Checkpoints sprang up on every road. Posters appeared offering rewards for information about terrorists. The Gestapo arrived in unmarked cars, their black coats glistening with rain. They questioned villagers, tore through barns, and dragged away anyone who hesitated to answer. The Jedburghs moved constantly now, never sleeping in the same place twice. Their survival depended entirely on the courage of the French people, bakers, priests and farmers who risked execution for hiding them. One slip of the tongue could end everything. In one village, a young woman named Claire offered her cellar as a radio post. Her husband had been taken by the Germans months earlier, yet she smiled as she helped André tune the transmitter. "If they find you here," George warned, "they'll kill you," she shrugged. "They already killed my husband. What more can they take?" A calm broke him. In her eyes, he saw the quiet defiance of millions, ordinary people who refused to bow, even as the noose tightened. Each transmission they sent now carried a piece of that defiance. Coordinates for supply drops, codes for new missions, reports on German troop movements. Every signal risked discovery, and one night it nearly happened. A direction-finding van, disguised as a milk truck, came rumbling down the street while they were still on air. The radio hissed as German sensors locked onto the frequency. André killed the transmission, and the team fled through the back door seconds before soldiers burst in. They hid in the hayloft of a barn while boots thundered below. The searchlights brushed across their faces. They did not breathe. For 3 hours, the world narrowed to the sound of dripping rain and distant barking dogs. When dawn came, they slipped away once more, exhausted, unwashed, and half-starved, but alive. The Germans had missed them by less than a minute. In London, their names were already being whispered with admiration. But in France, they were hunted like animals. Yet despite the danger, their work spread. New cells formed, new bridges fell, and the resistance began to move as one body. The Jedburghs had become more than soldiers. They were a contagion. The idea that even under occupation, freedom could still strike back, but the higher their impact, the greater the risk. The Gestapo was learning fast, tightening the net around the resistance. And soon, the Jedburghs would learn that the enemy's deadliest weapon wasn't a rifle or a bomb. It was betrayal. The betrayal came, as it always did, not from the sky or the enemy's guns, but from a whisper. In war, treachery wears a familiar face. It begins with a glance held too long, a question asked too casually, a villager who smiles a little too easily when German trucks pass. By the summer of 1944, France had become a labyrinth of loyalty and fear. Every partisan movement, every secret network, was one informant away from annihilation. For the Jedburghs, survival had become a balancing act between invisibility and action. They needed to strike constantly to remind the Germans that control was slipping through their fingers. But every attack drew blood, and the Gestapo always came to collect. George Starr's team had moved through 4 safe houses in a single week, each one discovered within days. Rumors began to spread. Someone in the local resistance was passing names to the Germans. It started small. A radio operator failed to return from a meeting. Then one of Renard's men vanished on his way to deliver ammunition. Within 48 hours, the Gestapo raided a farmhouse near Limoges, the one where Claire had once hidden them. She was taken. No one ever saw her again. When George heard the news, he said nothing. He only stared at the floor, his fists clenched until the knuckles went white. By then, the Gestapo had learned to mimic the resistance's codes, luring agents into traps. The Jedburghs countered by moving deeper into the countryside, cutting themselves off even from their own allies. They became phantoms, sleeping in forests, living off canned rations, keeping their transmissions short and infrequent. André barely spoke anymore. His face had changed. He had seen too much of what the Germans did to captured partisans. The torture chambers in Limoges, the hangings in the town square, those were warnings, not punishments. The Gestapo wanted them afraid. But fear was a currency the Jedburghs refused to spend. On the 17th of June, intelligence came from London. A German supply convoy carrying munitions was set to pass near Brive-la-Gaillarde. If destroyed, it would cripple reinforcements heading north toward Normandy. The order was simple: hit it, leave nothing. They gathered what remained of their cell, 9 men and 2 women, and moved under cover of darkness. The road ran through a narrow valley lined with trees, the perfect place for an ambush. They placed charges along the bend, hidden under loose stones and branches. The night was still, the only sound the distant croak of frogs and the faint hiss of the detonator wires being uncoiled. Then came the hum of engines. Headlights swept across the trees, 3 trucks, 1 armored car, and a motorcycle at the front. George gave the signal. The world exploded. The blast lifted the first truck off the road, a bloom of orange fire against the black sky. The convoy screeched to a halt as resistance fighters opened fire from both sides. The air filled with shouts, gunfire, and smoke. André's Steen gun jammed. He cursed and drew his pistol. Renard lobbed a grenade into the second truck. A flash, a scream, and then silence. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The road burned. The Jedburghs melted into the forest once again, their silhouettes flickering against the flames. They carried their wounded on makeshift stretchers, knowing the Germans would arrive within the hour. By dawn, German patrols were everywhere. Flyers were posted across nearby villages. Reward for the capture of saboteurs. 100,000 francs. Death to traitors. The resistance knew what that meant. The reprisals would come soon, and they did. Entire hamlets were emptied, men shot against walls, women and children deported. The Jedburghs listened to the news over their radio, their victory turning to ash in their mouths. War was supposed to bring liberation. Instead, it had brought judgment. Days later, they received word that Renard had been captured. He had gone to retrieve hidden supplies and walked straight into a German trap. When the Gestapo broadcast his interrogation through local channels, a cruel attempt to terrify others, George heard his friend's voice only once before the sound cut off. The betrayal was confirmed soon after. A local farmer, pressured by threats to his family, had given names to the Germans. It wasn't malice, it was fear. And yet, in the logic of resistance, fear was treason. Andre wanted to execute the man. George stopped him. "We're no better than them if we start killing our own," he said. But even as he spoke, he wasn't sure he believed it. The line between justice and vengeance was dissolving. Every German killed was paid for in French lives. Each act of sabotage saved the Allies hours, but cost villages days of grief. The Jedburghs had become catalysts of both hope and suffering, liberators and executioners in the same breath. Still, they pressed on. Orders from London demanded continued disruption as the Allied front advanced. They dynamited railways, derailed trains, and struck convoys with the precision of surgeons operating in darkness. The Gestapo never caught them, but they came close, too close, on a grey morning outside Toul. The team was sheltering in an abandoned chapel when they heard the sound of engines. Trucks, dozens of them. The Jedburghs barely had time to scatter before German soldiers surrounded the village. Smoke grenades filled the air, shouts echoed through the stone walls. George and Andre fought their way through a side door, diving into a ditch as bullets cracked overhead. For an hour, they crawled through mud and blood while the world burned behind them. When they finally reached the forest, they collapsed under the trees. "We can't keep doing this," Andre muttered. His voice was hoarse, his eyes hollow. "Every time we strike, they kill 10 more. George looked at him, the weight of command pressing down like stone. "If we stop," he said quietly, "they'll kill everyone." The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Weeks later, when the Allies finally broke through from Normandy, the Jedburghs were still fighting. They guided paratroopers to safe zones, directed artillery from the shadows, and cleared paths for advancing divisions. Their sabotage had done what it was meant to do, cripple the enemy's response, fracture their logistics, sow panic in their ranks. But victory came with no celebration. When they entered one of the liberated villages, they found the walls lined with photographs, the faces of those who had been executed during the occupation. Among them was Claire. Someone had drawn a small blue flower beside her name. George didn't speak for a long time. He simply removed his cap, looked at the faces, and whispered, "We did what we had to do." And in that whisper was the truth of every secret war, that freedom is never clean, and the hands that fight for it are never unstained. The liberation of France did not arrive with fanfare for the men who fought in its shadows. It came creeping, ragged through fire and dust, not as a sudden dawn, but as a dim light returning to a land long starved of it. The Allied armies were advancing from the north and west, the thunder of their artillery echoing across valleys that had once been silent under occupation. For the first time in years, French villagers dared to look to the horizon and whisper that the war might be turning. But for George Starr and his Jedburgh team, liberation was not an event. It was a reckoning. They had spent months invisible, unacknowledged and unsung, living like ghosts in barns and forests, sabotaging trains, ambushing convoys, losing comrades to torture and betrayal. Now, as columns of American tanks rolled through the countryside, their war was slipping from the darkness into daylight. But daylight was not always kind. It revealed what the night had hidden: burned farms, mass graves, the empty houses of those who had been executed for helping them. The cost of victory was written across the land in ash and silence. When the first American patrol reached their sector, the meeting was almost surreal. George watched as his countrymen, soldiers in clean uniforms, their helmets gleaming, stepped out of their jeeps and stared at the ragged men who emerged from the trees. The Jedburghs looked nothing like the soldiers they once were. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt, their eyes far older than their years. One of the Americans asked, "You boys been out here long?" George only smiled faintly. "Feels like a lifetime." The resistance fighters came out of hiding too, waving tricolour flags that had been buried for years. They cried, laughed, embraced the soldiers, and sang songs they had whispered in secret. But alongside the celebration there was something else, a quiet rage. Old scores rose to the surface. Collaborators were hunted in the streets. Women accused of consorting with German soldiers were dragged from their homes, their heads shaved, paraded before crowds that screamed for justice but tasted of vengeance. The lines had blurred. In liberation, morality was no clearer than in war. The Jedburghs were ordered to help stabilize the chaos, but how do you bring peace to a country that has been at war with itself? They tried to mediate, to keep the violence from consuming the joy. Yet even as they disarmed mobs, they understood the hunger behind it. The French were not celebrating the end of war. They were exercising it. For George, the reckoning was personal. Every liberated town brought ghosts. He saw the places where Claire had once lived, where Renard had led them, where André had lost faith in everything but the mission. In each, he found reminders of how many had died to make this moment possible. The Jedburghs had been told they were helping to set France ablaze. No one had told them that fire, once lit, doesn't choose what it burns. In late August, they entered Limoges, the same city where the Gestapo had hunted them like animals only weeks before. The Gestapo headquarters stood empty now, its windows shattered, papers scattered across the floors. The rooms still smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. George walked through them in silence, stopping at the interrogation chamber. The walls were stained. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its leather straps cut. André stood beside him, eyes fixed on the ground. "This is where they took Renard," he said softly. George nodded. And Claire. The silence between them was not just grief, it was guilt. They had fought to bring this day, but it had come too late for so many. Liberation, they realized, was not victory. It was survival, nothing more. The weeks that followed blurred into one long, feverish campaign of coordination. The Jedburghs worked to connect local resistance groups with the advancing Allied command, turning scattered bands of guerrillas into organized forces. They helped secure bridges, capture German stragglers, and guard supply lines. Their names began to surface in Allied reports. Anonymous heroes, referred to only by code names. Yet with every success, George felt the weight of the war growing heavier, not lighter. One evening, as they sat around a campfire outside Toulouse, André asked, "Do you think anyone will ever know what we did?" George looked into the flames. "If we did it right," he said, "they'll never have to." That night, a message came over the radio from London. Their mission was officially concluded. The war in France was turning irrevocably in the Allies' favor. The Jedburghs were to await extraction within the week. The words brought no relief, only emptiness. After so long living on the edge of death, peace felt alien. It was quieter, yes, but quieter like a graveyard. When the extraction plane finally came, they were flown back to England under cover of night. The landing at Tempsford airfield was silent and unceremonious. No parades, no fanfare. They were debriefed in small rooms by officers who spoke of commendable efficiency and mission success. The language of bureaucracy was colder than the war had ever been. In the following days, the team began to disperse. André returned to France to rebuild what was left of his home. Colin Bancroft was reassigned to training new agents for missions in the Pacific. George stayed behind in London, restless and sleepless, haunted by the faces of those who had not come back. He would later say that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting, it was learning how to live afterward. Years later, when he visited France again, the scars of war were still visible. The fields had healed, but the memories hadn't. In Limoges, a small memorial stood where the resistance had once operated. It bore no grand inscription, only the names of the fallen, and among them two familiar ones, Renard, Claire. George stood there a long time, hat in hand, as the wind moved gently through the grass. The sound reminded him of the parachute silk rustling in the night sky over France, the beginning of everything. Freedom, he thought, is never free. It's paid for in silence, in sacrifice, and in names that history forgets. But as long as someone remembers the story, as long as someone speaks it aloud, those ghosts never truly die. They called them ghost soldiers, but ghosts don't shape the world. The Jedburghs did. When the guns finally fell silent, their deeds vanished into classified reports and dusty archives, but the methods they forged in fire would ripple through decades of modern warfare. From the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, every time a covert team dropped behind enemy lines, the shadow of the Jedburghs followed. In the years after the war, most of the surviving teams were quietly folded back into civilian life. Their missions had been secret, their faces unknown, their victories uncredited. George Starr never returned to a normal life. He tried, took postings, attended briefings, but the peacetime world felt too clean, too unreal. The smell of paper and ink could not replace gun oil and rain. He often dreamed of the drop, the plane, the light turning green, the fall through empty sky. In those moments between earth and cloud, he had never felt freer. In the post-war years, intelligence services studied the Jedburgh operations like holy scripture. Small units dropped deep into hostile territory. Cooperation between nations, British, American, and Free French, sharing information, training, and tactics. They had operated with limited communication, improvising with whatever they could find. No uniformed army could match that kind of adaptability. The Jedburghs had proven that war could be fought not just with divisions and tanks, but with ideas, mobility, secrecy, and trust built under fire. Their missions became the template for everything that followed. The CIA's early paramilitary units, the OSS's evolution into organized intelligence, even the birth of modern special forces, all traced their lineage back to the night jumps over occupied Europe. The men who had once been hunted by the Gestapo were now instructors, founders, architects of an entirely new kind of warfare. They had learned painfully that sometimes a whisper could destroy a fortress faster than a bomb. But the legacy wasn't just strategic. It was moral and far more complicated. For all their bravery, the Jedburghs had lived in a world without clarity. They had killed to save, destroyed to liberate, sacrificed lives for seconds of advantage. When historians later wrote about them, they spoke of courage and innovation, of how they prepared the ground for D-Day. Yet those who had been there remembered something different: the doubt, the moments between orders, when you had to choose between two wrongs and pray one was less evil than the other. George often said that the true enemy was not the Wehrmacht, nor the Gestapo. It was despair. The moment when you began to believe the world would never be right again. And though the war ended, that enemy never left him. He visited France once more in 1954, on the 10th anniversary of the invasion. The world was changing again, colonies breaking free, nations rebuilding, the Cold War casting its long shadow across Europe. In Paris, no one spoke much of the Jedburghs anymore. Their missions had been replaced by new kinds of secrecy, new kinds of fear. Yet in the countryside, in villages rebuilt from rubble, their memory lingered. He traveled to Limoges, then south to the same valley where the ambush had taken place years before. The trees had grown back. Children played by the road where fire had once burned through steel. And in a small stone chapel, the same one where he and André had almost died, there was now a plaque. It read, "To the shadows who fought for dawn." He stood there for hours, not as a soldier, not as an agent, but as a man trying to understand what it had all meant. So many of the faces had faded, so many of the names were gone. André had joined the French army, later killed in Indochina. Colin Bancroft had died in a car accident. London had moved on, as it always did. The Jedburghs were history now, just another secret that time preferred to forget, but the ghosts did not rest. In the decades that followed, their philosophy, that small teams could shift the course of nations, became the foundation of every covert operation. Green Berets, the SAS, CIA paramilitary teams, all of them carried fragments of the same doctrine. The courage to act without orders, the trust between strangers, the acceptance of impossible odds. It was as if the Jedburghs had passed their fire down through generations of soldiers who would never know their names. And yet, George knew that something had been lost along the way. The purity of purpose, the fight not for territory or politics, but for the soul of a country under occupation. In the new wars, there were no clear lines, no occupied villages waiting for liberation. Just endless grey, where victory was measured in information rather than freedom. He sometimes wondered if the world had learned too much from them. The Jedburghs had taught the art of resistance, but they had also taught how to dismantle it. What they began as a struggle for liberation became the architecture of modern espionage, the blueprint for quiet wars fought in boardrooms and deserts alike. But perhaps that too was inevitable. Once you teach humanity how to fight in the shadows, you can never unteach it. Near the end of his life, George was interviewed by a young historian who had found his name buried in an old OSS file. She asked what it had felt like to jump into darkness, to live among strangers, to fight a war that most never even knew existed. He smiled faintly, his eyes lost in memory. It felt, he said, like holding a match in a storm. You don't expect to survive it. You just hope someone else sees the light before it goes out. When he died, the notice was small, a few lines in the paper. No medals listed, no mention of his code name, no hint that he had once helped turn the tide of a world war. But a letter arrived from France addressed simply to the man who kept his promise. Inside was a pressed blue flower, the same kind Claire had drawn beside her name on the wall of the memorial. It was as if the past had reached across time, reminding him, and all who would read his story, that some debts are never forgotten. The Jedburghs' war had ended, but their lesson endured, that courage need not be seen to be real, that the most decisive battles are often fought in silence, and that the price of freedom is not glory, but endurance. In the quiet fields of France, where wildflowers grow over forgotten drop zones, their legacy remains, not carved in stone, but written in the invisible language of those who still resist, who still believe, who still light small fires in the dark, and as long as there are people willing to fight unseen for others, for hope, for something greater than themselves, the ghosts of the Jedburghs will never fade. Their war was fought in silence. Their victory was measured in freedom. And their story, though born in shadow, belongs forever to the light.